In May of 1864, 4 months after the crew of the Grafton were marooned on Auckland Island, another ship, the Invercauld, would wreck on the other end of the island. Neither group would know about the other. And while the Grafton would become a survival tale, a story of what to do when marooned, and working toward a common goal, they would all make it off the island. The Invercauld, on the other hand, would become a cautionary tale of what not to do when marooned, and what happens when there is a complete failure and lack of leadership. So what happened? Let's find out. Hello and welcome to History's a Disaster. I'm your host Andrew, and tonight we are looking into the Invercauld Shipwreck. This was originally supposed to be a part of the Grafton episode, but due to some time constraints, I had to cut the episode short, so now I'm making up for it. The Invercauld was a merchant ship traveling from Melbourne to Callao, Peru, to pick up a load of batshit, or guano, or fertilizer, or whatever you want to call it, for delivery to England. The 25-man crew was commanded by Captain George Dalgarno. Not long after leaving port, they hit some pretty shitty weather that kept getting worse. The lookout soon spotted land, which was determined to be the southern end of Auckland Island. The ship was ordered to turn more to the south, as the wind blew harder from the north. The high waves and pounding rain cut visibility drastically. Then the call for land ahead was shouted once more. Captain Dalgarno had the ship brought to the north, laying on more sail. They hoped to pass quickly between what the captain assumed was two separate islands. Night had fallen, so had visibility. To make things worse, the storm increased in intensity. The high wind was pushing the boat toward shore. Tall rocky cliffs appeared out of the darkness as the ship crashed through the waves. These waves broke against a rocky shoreline. They were now trapped between the wind and the looming rocks, without any sort of control over the ship. The horrible wind drove them broadside into the rocks as waves crashed over the decks. The men had no time to react. Their ship was being torn apart and literally ripped out from beneath their feet. Boots and heavy clothing was abandoned as the crew were swept into the water. The wind and waves would smash them against rock and timber as they tried to make it to shore. The battered and freezing crew would make it to shore in a small cove between the high cliffs. They huddled together in the night to try to get whatever kind of heat the waterlogged survivors could manage in the sleet and the rain. At daybreak, a head count was taken. 19 survivors. 6 men had been lost to the sea in the wreck. They used pieces of the wreckage that washed ashore to build temporary shelter from the weather. Out in the bay, the only trace of the Invercauld was a part of the rear of the ship hung up on the rocks, and the bodies of the 6 who drowned were found washed ashore. They stripped the dead of their clothes and were able to salvage a few pounds of salted pork and biscuits. Food would become scarce for the 19 survivors. 2 boxes of waterlogged matches had been saved and a fire was lit. However, in an ill-fated attempt to dry the matches out, 1 box would be lost to the fire. They would eventually make an attempt to climb the high cliffs overhead to seek out better shelter than the rocky shore provided. They would lose another man to these cliffs when he slipped and fell to the beach below. Atop the cliffs, the ragged survivors pushed inland, barefoot, through the grass and scrub brush. On the move, they found plenty of fresh water and were able to catch a small pig to support the diet of edible roots they had gathered. 4 more survivors would be lost to fatigue and exposure as they made the trek inland. 6 men, tired of walking through the bush and the lack of leadership from Dalgarno. At this point, he had made no attempts to organize or lead his men, broke away from the group, and returned to the beach and the site of the wreckage. They spent 5 days on the beach in the small shelter that had been previously built. In desperation, one of the crew suggested cannibalism and that lots should be drawn to determine who should die. Disgusted, one of the men, Robert Holding, left the group fearing for his life. He would later rejoin the main group. The rest would never be seen again. After weeks of wandering, the 10 surviving crewmen made it to a small bay on the eastern side of the island. They were able to locate a small feast of limpets. Captain Dalgarno and his first mate, Andrew Smith, and second mate, James Mahoney, remained fixated on their former ranks and refused to lift a finger to fetch water or shuck the shellfish they found, much preferring to order the other survivors around. When Robert Holding refused to be ordered around to fetch him some roots, James pulled a knife on him and made threats. A standoff occurred and eventually James backed down. The limpets eventually ran out and they were forced to leave the bay in search of food. Berry bushes would be located, and on finding this, they stumbled upon the abandoned settlement of Hardwick. The settlement had not endured well since being abandoned over a decade prior. Only a single home and lean-to remained of the original 18 buildings. They did, however, find tools and other items scavenged to help the survivors. A seal was also captured and cooked. Captain Dalgarno blindly believed that the settlement was a whaling station and that people would be back in the summer and they would be rescued. So no attempts were made to fix up and reinforce the shelters. Everyone ignored the clear signs it had been abandoned long ago. Captain Dalgarno also refused to organize hunting and foraging parties, and what food was in the area quickly dried up. 2 more of the crew would die before Robert convinced Andrew Smith and 2 of the seamen to break camp and search for another where food would be more plentiful. Captain Dalgarno would be left behind to look after James Mahoney, who had gotten previously injured. Days later, he would abandon James, leaving him to starve to death alone. One night, during an altercation between the 2 seamen, Fritz Hauser and Harvey would shove Fritz out of the small bush shack they shared. Fritz hit the ground and never got up again. Unable to dig into the frozen ground, they covered his body with branches. Days later, they would catch Harvey with a mouthful of Fritz. He had been gnawing on the corpse. Harvey would eventually die of starvation. Only Captain Dalgarno, Andrew Smith, and Robert Holding remained. Robert would take command of the group and would be responsible for keeping the other 2 alive. They would make a canoe out of sealskin and branches. Although this canoe leaked like crazy, requiring one man to constantly bail out water, it made the hunt for food so much easier. They would survive on fish, birds, and the occasional seal they were able to hunt down. As the months dragged on, and the rescue seemed more and more unlikely, they returned to the abandoned settlement and demolished the huts for the timber to build a boat to attempt to escape. After the boat was nearly complete, a storm swept in and pushed it out to sea. Discouraged, they used the remaining timber they found to build another. They used this to travel to nearby islands off the shore of Auckland in search of food. On one of these islands, they would find an abundance of rabbits that they were eventually able to capture and use to supplement their diets. Trapped and with another winter fast approaching, they built up a sturdier hut than they had with a chimney for a fire to make it through the coming bleak winter months. In May, a Portuguese ship, the Julian, appeared in the bay. They were leaking badly and stopped to fix the hole and take shelter. They had been traveling to Macau from South America. They would end up taking the 3 survivors with them. On board, Delgarno pulled rank, and him and Smith were clothed and lodged with the other officers on board, while Robert would be sent below with the other seamen. They would arrive in Peru in June of 1865. Delgarno would visit the British Embassy and be sent back to England that night on a mailboat, abandoning his former crew for good. Andrew Smith would be hospitalized for several months, and Robert Holding, broke and penniless, would survive off the charity of the crew of the Julian and money given to him by sailors from a visiting British warship. He would eventually find work and return to Rotterdam in October of 1865. He would end up living to the age of 93. All three survivors would go on to write books about their experiences on the island. All of them were a bit contradictory, with Robert Holding's account placing the majority of the blame on Captain Delgarno and a severe lack of leadership, which led to a growing sense of every man for themselves, leading to the deaths of most of the crew. Now, while some of this may be true, the crew of the Invercauld, unlike the Grafton, had a whole shitload of bad luck. The Grafton survivors were better equipped to handle their experience, along with being able to salvage more supplies from the wreck. And they had the good fortune to land in an area that had much better resources. Food was more readily available. What the Grafton lacked was shelter and tools, which they would make for themselves. While on the other hand, the Invercauld was able to find some shelter and tools. However, resources were scarce, with food not being as abundant. They would have also required more food than the Grafton. It's much harder to feed 19 people on less food than it is 5. No matter how you look at it, these two groups, separated by less than 20 miles, had vastly different experiences, even though they were in the same place at the same time. And that was the Invercauld Shipwreck. Thanks for listening, and if you liked the episode, please consider leaving a rating or review on your app of choice, or email the show at historiesadisaster@gmail.com, or hit us up on Facebook and Instagram at historiesadisaster with questions and comments. Or, even better, share the episode. And remember, sharing is caring. And if there is more caring in the world, maybe history wouldn't be a disaster. Thanks and goodbye.